Yeah, I'm Alex Patterson. I'm a senior developer advocate for Appwrite, and we just introduced not that long ago a new capability to use GraphQL within Appwrite. So we've always had our REST-based APIs that you were able to access, and as well as our JavaScript SDK. But I thought it would be kind of cool to come on, and Brian thankfully let me come on and show off kind of some of this GraphQL side of things. So. Probably should have showed that. There you go. There is that nice slide that Brian had up earlier. You can find us on appwrite.io. To join our Discord, we have an amazing community. I feel like it's what separates Appwrite from a lot of the other backend as a service. So that's at appwrite.io/Discord. And everything that we're going to be talking about, you can also find on our GitHub repo too. So it's github.com/Appwrite is the org, and you can find everything from there. So the interesting part as we dive through this is you may ask, why did we introduce this whole GraphQL piece? And it took us a while. Our engineering team was hard at work, probably over the course of 6 months to a year, really kind of honing in on getting this right. And the reason being that people were requesting it like crazy. So we're very much a community focused as far as introducing new features, and this one kept popping up. So it was something that we were working on, as well as kind of continuing to build out the Appwrite infrastructure as well at the same time. And one of the things that often gets asked, which we'll kind of go through here, is why not just stick with the REST APIs? Well, we have that as well as GraphQL. And one of the reasons for that, as we dive through it here, as you can see, is some of the improvements that you'll get from GraphQL. So I'm going to start on the REST side of things just to kind of offset this conversation a little bit. I don't want it just to be all GraphQL when there's so much more to it than that. So in our basic, or in our old version and current version, we have the REST APIs. And why would you use those outside of GraphQL? Fine-tuning specific queries. And we'll talk about some of what that means and the specifics around it as I go through the demo a little further. REST can do everything that GraphQL can do. So we all know that because we had it before. There's actually some items in our REST API that doesn't match up with GraphQL. And I think you'll find this across the board. I'm also part of the AWS community, and they use a product called Amplify. Amplify is kind of a reverse from ours. When you decide which backend to use, you have to pick that up front. And the reason for that is if you're down the GraphQL side of things, you'll actually get the synchronization at that point. If you're using the REST-based version, you won't get that. And that's kind of the same for Appwrite as well. If you're using our GraphQL version, we really would rather have you use REST for that, not our GraphQL. So just know that up front. However, REST can do everything that GraphQL can do. So I don't want to put that down as we go along. Some of the tasks that are more complex using GraphQL, when you set up an Apollo client, or if you're using one of our SDKs, when you first get started with that, you have to kind of learn a whole new paradigm. If you're used to using GraphQL, great. I think you're already in that, and you can probably use that for a lot of applications. But if you're using an application and you just want something quick and easy to get set up, REST tends to be a lot easier to set that up, especially as we kind of go down the list here. The error handling is what I find is probably the hardest thing on the GraphQL side. Once you're used to it, I think it's fine. But if you're used to status codes and HTTP statuses coming back and forth, that can be a little bit of a challenge as you go through that. So definitely kind of understand the pros and cons there of staying with REST versus the GraphQL side. So why use GraphQL? The biggest reason, and I'll show you some of this, is the multiple data sources. I can't preach this enough. You've probably seen, Brian was just talking about Netlify. They just acquired Gatsby, and Gatsby has a new product that they're utilizing for GraphQL as well. And when they are using that, they're taking tons of different data sources and putting those all into a single GraphQL space. So you're able to hit that one endpoint and get back a ton of different data as you query it. So that's kind of number one. I would probably put that the highest on my list for going down the GraphQL side of things. It really simplifies that task of going out and fetching everything, but not having to find different APIs, different schema types, and things like that. Secondly, and kind of additionally, the bandwidth concerns. So a lot of times when you're calling REST APIs, you're just getting everything back that they can send you. With GraphQL, what you do is you ask for exactly what you'd like back, and that's what it sends. So that's the reduction on the bandwidth side. And as many of you probably know, what that means for mobile is huge. So if you only ask for a small amount of data when you're on the mobile side of things, that's going to help out a ton for those users. The data fetching control, that's that piece of it. And then we talked about the rapid prototyping. So the interesting thing there, conversely to what I was speaking about on the REST API side of things, when we talk about rapid prototyping, if you only have to hit a single API and you're doing the backend and front end setup, it becomes a lot easier at that point too. So that allows for that design to go full stack across what you're working on. So I just want to read this one. In a REST architecture, the client makes an HTTP request and data is sent as an HTTP response, while in GraphQL, the client requests with data with queries. And so this is probably better as an example to show. And so on the left, we have multiple gets that are occurring here. So you'll see that on this top one, you have a single get, and that is grabbing a piece of data for user. And then on the bottom one, you have posts and followers. So those are all get calls and multiple of them. On the right side, you have your GraphQL post. A GraphQL call is always going to be a post, and that's part of the learning curve. You can't just hit in a browser. You can't just hit this because those are all gets. So on the right side, what you have here is a query, and that query is asking for in the user side of things, they have posts and followers within the data endpoints. And you'll notice also under posts, they're just asking for title, under followers, just name. And so you get exactly what you want back, reducing that data payload too. So you can see kind of the pros and cons as we keep going down the list here of REST versus GraphQL. I'm going to show you this in a live demo as we get going here. But this is a comparison on two React applications that we have. On the left side is using the REST-based architecture. And you'll notice if you ignore the .css ones there, all of these different calls have data coming back in terms of like 1 kilobyte, 2.5 kilobytes, 3.1 kilobytes, and they all take time. On the right side, what we have over there is 11 kilobytes of data in 39 milliseconds, which is almost the equivalent to about 2 of these calls on the left. And you can see that in a single call, we're getting all of that data back. So it's really important to kind of see that in real world terms, what that actually looks like on a REST versus GraphQL call. Oh, this is my gift that doesn't work, Brian. That's okay. Basically, what this slide is representing is just how the GraphQL piece works on the Appwrite side of things. So what this is basically showing is, I'll show it to you once we get to the demo side of things, but it's where we place GraphQL in our architecture in Appwrite. So it sits equal or kind of beside the REST API. So it's actually going to get all of our security protection, all of those nice firewall pieces above it too. So here in our Explorer, you can see different ways of actually getting the GraphQL data. So a couple different examples out here, and I'll walk through our docs so we can kind of compare this too. But this is an example for account creation and account create email session. So you can actually make both of those calls directly within the GraphQL, just like you would our REST API. The database create side of things. So on that first one, that's more client based. On this one, this tends to be more on the server side. So when you're creating a database or a collection, you can almost think of collections as tables. So when you're doing those items, those are typically activities that you're doing more on like an admin side of things. So if you're setting up an application and you want to create those backend features as you're going, maybe you have a self-hosted like CMS and you're allowing those users to set those things up. This is the call that will allow that to happen too. So I just wanted to call out here, it's not just client-based, you can do this on the server as well. So these are the demos. These are all going to come from github.com/Appwrite and then demos for React. There's two different spots we're going to look in there. Brian, if I can switch over to the screen share, you got it. Thanks. So in this example, let me open up VS Code first of all, just to kind of show you what we're looking at. So both of these examples are in that repo I was just talking about. One is the locale example, and that's going to be on our REST-based APIs. So that's this one here on the left. And then we have the example GraphQL, and that's going to be this file that you see here on the right. So I've actually gone ahead and spun both of these up so we can take a look at the application. They're very similar, and we're continually trying to get these closer and closer so people have less confusion on these. But I just want to show some of those live calls. So again, 5173, port 5173. This is our locale example using our REST API. So you'll see here, if I refresh this page, you'll see that the locale was called. And here's a preview of that data coming back. Again, it's a get call. I see a 200, which is a good status, and the data is represented back on the screen here. So as I go down the list here, you can see countries are coming in now, EU countries, phone codes, and this is kind of that makeup as we go along. All of these are GET requests because they're just grabbing data. There's no update necessary. So for REST, that typically means you're going to make a GET call, not a put, not a post, not a delete, anything like that. So as we continue down the list here, you'll see that every one of these calls that represents data up here has to be called individually. And that's the big difference on the REST side. Now with GraphQL, if I compare just the locale example here, I can do the same thing, and we'll walk through the code on each of these, and you'll get those individual calls. So let me bring the network tab up here. So if I go EU countries, phone codes, you'll notice all of these are hitting the GraphQL endpoint. So if I flip back real quick, these are named. So this is another big thing that people like to compare and contrast on GraphQL. Especially in ours. Some GraphQL endpoints have some different naming mechanisms and things like this, but typically what you'll see are named routes here on the REST side, and on the GraphQL, it's always going to be the same route that you're hitting. You can see that it's a post call that comes in, and it's always going to be that 200, whether it's an error or not an error, unless something is like really bad, and then you're going to get a 500 or something like that. So here is what is actually sent over. And this can also be a little bit frustrating for people to like read through. There are some cool like plugins that you can get to list out these queries, but we'll take a look at the queries in VS Code. So just know these are all set up as individual calls. And then I have one large one at the end here I set up called all. And all actually has every single one of these made in that single call to GraphQL. So here is our GraphQL query with all of those different things in it. And then I'll dive in after I kind of walk through the code a little further to show you the databases. Just gonna sneak out, Brian, if there's any questions as I'm going on here. I don't see anything at the moment. Gatsby is cool. I agree. Okay. So as I'm walking through here, let me jump out to VS Code again. So something I want to just call out for Appwrite, we do have SDKs in all of the major languages. I'll bring up some of the docs as we go along here. As you can see, we have web, Flutter, Apple, Android server. We can have as many SDKs as we want as well. So if there's ever a SDK that you're interested in and we just don't have the platform listed out here, feel free, pull request it. There's awesome ways to do that. So the one thing I want to call out on our docs, We do have this overall GraphQL, but and this is current. This might change in the future. Let me bump up the font a little bit. So this is our main GraphQL page where it talks about how to make these different requests and how to kind of get that, where's the authentication piece going. It walks through similar to what I'm talking about, GraphQL versus REST, selection sets, all of that. But more importantly, when you start to reference our API now, if I go to account, and I'm in this web SDK, what you can actually do is switch this out to GraphQL. So it gives you a better example of each of these. So you can actually see when you go through here, now I have a mutation call out. So that's on the create side. If I were to flip this back to our REST call, it will actually show you that same post equivalent. So it's an easy way to kind of learn GraphQL through our endpoints too, if you want to dive back and forth between the two. Okay, back on the VS Code side of things, we're going to look at exactly that, what I was just showing you. So the get locale endpoint, if you were to go through our documentation, it is just this locale where we instantiate it. And then once we have an instance of that, the locale.get is going to make our REST API call for us. The very same thing that we make in our GraphQL side of the house looks like this. So it's always going to be GraphQL. You won't get multiple endpoints. So if I switched from, say, database to locale, we'd actually need another one in here like this. You'd need database equals new. We would pull that in from our SDK. So it would come in here. So every time I needed some new piece of data, I would actually have to update that. Now, there's not that many, but just as comparison, if I go over to my GraphQL side, I can jump between all of those. So here is a database example down here where I am updating, creating. Here's a list of documents. So I'm still using our GraphQL endpoint and using a different query for that. So just keep that in mind as well. In my opinion, it's kind of cool that I can stay all within that same GraphQL call in our SDK. So here is get locale. We just looked at get countries, same thing. So you have your list countries here. What it's going to do on this side is locale list countries, and so on and so forth. But the big one for me on all of this call, we get down to the bottom, and you'll remember on the screen what this looked like. We have this all tab. That I couldn't do on this API side unless I did all of the API calls at once. And a good way to do that would be like do promise.all and let them all resolve back, and then you could push the data. But you have to remember that on the HTTP side of things, you're still going to get all of those calls no matter what. The difference here is this function that we have. So the get all locale function is actually going to specify a new query where we have every single one of these locales presented within the query itself. So that's why we're able to call out to GraphQL in one shot, one HTTP out here too, which is really cool for all of our data points. So that's how you can kind of compare and contrast, just even in a generic sense. If you wanted to check out REST versus GraphQL, that's kind of the read side of it. So these are our get commands. What I want to dive into next is just a simple example of how to use Appwrite's GraphQL to write to a database. So in order to do that, I wanted to just show off our new console and what it looks like. So this is our new organization called Demos for React. I could have named this DevRel or Dev CFE or whatever I want, or CFE.dev or whatever I wanted to. The project that I have, you could have multiple projects within a single org. So this is my project level. All of our items at this point, you can click copy and you'll see I've named this one Demos for React just for simplicity. But this is typically like a generated ID. So in here, I also have a database created. So our default database right now is MariaDB. That could change in the future. We have work going on, and I'll probably get killed for this later, but we do have work going on for Postgres and MongoDB. They're in the works. I don't know when. That's the part I won't give away. So we have these databases out here, and just to test this out, I'm going to look at our to-do database and the collection to-dos. So you'll see here I have data that's already in here in our collection. You can think of this as just a table in a database. And let me jump out to our database example. So here's that first to do. What I want to do is break all of these down. So I'm going to put on here. Let me just put CFE for the first one. I'm going to click add. So let's take a look at, actually, I wanted to clear that first. Let's try that again. So this is actually a mutation at this point. So you'll see localhost version 1, that's our endpoint. We're hitting the GraphQL endpoint always for this. And instead of a query, we were actually doing a mutation this time. So if I take a look at our payload, there's different variables that we're passing in. So here's our collection ID, our database ID, and this unique is a unique thing. So that actually tells the database, go ahead and create a document ID on your own for this. Now the response to that, what happened was all of this. So this came back as a database create document, and it has data of to do, it's not done, and all of the different permissions. The cool part about Appwrite is we can wrap all of these different permissions around who's allowed to create that. The only item that came back is this ID, and that's from creating that in the payload. So if I take and look at this unique again, when we look at the preview, that's the ID for that specific entry. So I'm going to go ahead and jump out to the console again and check that out. Oops. So here is our document ID that we were just created. I can take a look at this document. Everything in Appwrite, and this part I just find mind-blowing still today. We can wrap security on individual items in that database too, in that collection. So you can see you can assign all of this as well. Currently, I just have our settings set up for our security just to allow anything right now, which is a little nuts. Don't do that in production, like wrap some roles and things around it. But this is that check mark, so you can do document level security as well. So I could say no one's allowed to create, read, update except for a certain person. Maybe I'm an admin. I can say for this role as an admin, go ahead and allow create only, and then the document security would provide that back to whomever I need granting that. So maybe it's just an individual user or what that might look like. And that goes for our REST APIs, our GraphQL, creating data through functions, you name it, that's going to be applied every single time. So to continue our little example here, we have our create document, and we have these created. I'm going to go ahead and rerun this query so we can get a look at what list documents does. So if I just refresh, you'll see this hits the GraphQL endpoint again, and it brings back a document list of documents with the correct IDs and everything. I'm going to also click this X, which runs delete, and you can see here there is a mutation that occurred. And this mutation is to delete document at that endpoint, and it specifies the collection ID, the database, and the document ID that was in that list. So that's kind of the back and forth of how GraphQL typically works and how it specifically works in Appwrite. So you can see there's some pros and cons involved in all of that. The difference being mainly that the naming mechanisms, endpoint names that is, versus hitting a single GraphQL endpoint, the timing if you do a lot of these. The other cool part is you can do multiple mutations when you're calling the GraphQL API. So there's a couple things in there that we walk through that really kind of set those off. And Brian, I don't know if you're able to, but at some point you can share out the YouTube videos. We have a deeper dive kind of on the new GraphQL features and things like that. But that's probably the long and short of my demo. Do we have questions we want to break into, or?
All right, that was cool.
I told Brian it would be quick. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm here. That's totally fine. So, folks, if you have any questions, put them in the chat or in the ask a question module. I'll ask a few of mine. So just to kind of get a quick understanding. At this point, we are querying. It is like I can get the information out of Appwrite via REST, or I can get information out of Appwrite via GraphQL. Is that like a choice I can make within my application? Like any of them, both those endpoints are available regardless of, like,
Yep.
When I create the thing, they're both available.
Yep. You don't have to not like the AWS Amplify where you kind of had to make a decision up front. You can use both at any point in time that you want in our setup for Appwrite. The one thing to kind of keep in mind is the real time. Real time currently, we're doing that mainly through the REST endpoint, and that could be different depending on the SDK, but that typically holds true.
Okay, and the real time is like just like obviously streaming data updates and stuff like that.
Exactly. So everything in Appwrite, which it still kind of blows my mind. If you're used to using like Firebase or something like that, your database updates tend to be real time or near real time, depending on if you're using the real time database or Firestore. However, in Appwrite, everything has eventing to it. So if a function finishes, we know there's an event. If a database updates, there's an event. So you can subscribe at any level within our system and get that subscription eventing. So I guess the easiest example or the easiest way to say it is, yes, you can do real-time updates. You can have two different windows open, Brian. You could be updating comments and they're going to stream over and I'll pick up the comment on my side.
Okay, very cool. Tony wants to know, is there like a Gatsby plugin for Appwrite already, or?
So I did write a Gatsby plugin. It's accepted. Someone, if you're using it, let me know. I haven't seen it in the wild quite yet, but I think it's this one. Yeah. So there is a Gatsby source Appwrite. It basically just has whatever databases you want to go out and list. What I did a demo on for this was just a blog. So essentially, you're able to take any of your blog posts, go out and grab them from the database, and it would list them out.
Okay.
I haven't used this in a while though, so please let me know if you try it out. I should probably update our examples.
Yeah, it's probably. Do you know which version of Gatsby you wrote it for?
It wasn't that long ago, so I should, but I don't. What are we up to now these days? I don't even remember. 15, 5, 7?
It's 5 something, right? I think.
I want to say I wrote it during the last bit of 4, but I think it will still work.
Yeah.
Now you're gonna make me want to.
Queen Ray is here. I'm sure she can answer that question.
Oh yes.
About which version of Gatsby we're up to.
it might be in the Git repo too. Like which one it's designed for, so we can pop that up and find out.
Okay. I mean, I'm assuming it should work for the new one, I guess.
Yeah, it should. I tried it on the new one. I know that.
Yeah. And I guess that in theory would mean it would work in Valhalla. I don't know a lot about Valhalla too, but I'm guessing.
Yeah, so that's something I want to play with Valhalla, is to see, because I know Valhalla you can take different endpoints for data too. So for folks, I think this is the real reason why Netlify ended up buying buying
absolutely.
Gatsby, but I don't know what of ashes is. I can't spell.
But, yeah. You're live searching on it. You never know what's going to come up, right?
That's true. They had a
Yeah.
great post on it not that long ago. I don't know where it went. But anyways, you can take, hey, there's Queen Ray right there. Maybe she can tell us all about it, right?
Yeah, I need to get around to do a presentation all about Valhalla because I'm very
Yeah.
curious.
Yeah, I'm pretty
Yeah,
excited about the Valhalla piece. So currently Netlify has their, what's it called? API graph or something like that.
yeah, the
I
open
feel like
graph
those
or
two
one
products,
graph.
those are gonna like
Yeah.
smush together, and those are gonna be
Yeah.
fantastic.
To be clear, like one interesting thing I found when I was researching a blog post that I wrote just the other day that one graph, the one graph piece, so they named it Netlify Graph, is now like not open for new signups. They
Yeah,
closed it.
I feel like
So
at one point you could like PR and add data sources, right?
yeah, I mean they were working to have partners and stuff do
Yeah,
data sources because they were talking to us, but I mean like it launched Darkly, which to be quite honest, like for launch Darkly, it doesn't make sense. We tell you not to use the API for most things unless you're not going to use it like in your unless you're trying to do things like add users or change
right.
the back like getting flag data that through the API doesn't make sense. But anyway,
Yeah, I know.
uh,
I used it with like Contentful. I tried some things out in Shopify, and we were doing a GitHub type of example too. So it's definitely going to be easy to grow that thing like crazy.
yeah, cool. So, what do you think in terms of your advice for folks? Like, obviously, you built the app twice. Like, is there what would be your guidance as to when would you suggest they go with the REST APIs versus when should they use GraphQL? Um, should they just go stick with one and use that continuously, or do you think are you like
I'm
you
gonna
switch
give
back and
my
forth?
consultant answer, and it depends, right? So
Yeah.
I would say first of all, if you're very comfortable with GraphQL and that's what you use day in day out, use it. But there's some caveats. Like I said, if you want those live subscriptions to the database and things like that, you're still gonna need REST. Um, if you're just spinning up something like super simple example for projects, I would just recommend using REST. It's going to be a lot more clear from the endpoint uh, part of things. I think it gets a little confusing, especially if you're trying to teach like newer devs on GraphQL and like what specifically those data points are and things like that.
Hmm.
We do have one, I shouldn't say drawback, but it's kind of a necessary thing. Appwrite, we try to accommodate everyone, right? So it's not as like specific to one thing, and we can't tune it specifically for one thing. On the GraphQL side of things, when you're setting up all of your database tables, you own the schema, right? So you can update those tables to have whatever you want in them with whatever foreign keys and everything else. What's difficult though from a GraphQL endpoint, we can only give you the options for like ID, created, deleted, like all of our base stuff. And then you get the data piece. You can't say which columns in our database. And this is today. This is still something that we're kind of trying to decide on, but the CPU cycle hit that it takes to say, well, give me these three columns of things, it's pretty intensive. So we did that on purpose we always want Appwrite's core to be as fast as possible. So I guess long story short, I would recommend if you're at the database point of that decision and you think you can choose whatever data you want coming in and out, don't do it that way. Like, don't pick GraphQL because of that reason. Now, if you have,
Okay.
like 25 tables of data, you have user profiles, you have comments, you have a post, all of those things that you would normally have with like a blog or whatever, and you need to pull those all at once, it might be a great option for you at that time because you have like
Mhm.
smaller tables that you're pulling all of the data at one time together. So again, I think it's skill set one is probably it's always DX developer experience in my opinion. That's going to keep your company afloat and people happy. So go with that first of all, and then secondarily, like kind of make some decisions after that.
Yeah. So what you're saying is the way that it works, I can't I like if I'm posting to to the GraphQL endpoint, it won't, it has to be everything, or is it even reading from like I get everything?
So even reading on the database side, all of our other
Okay.
endpoints are pre-specified, right? They have a schema already. So
Okay.
a great example is probably, if you want to bring it back up, I could show you. So like this is our locale example.
Hmm.
In this, I can remove any of these. Like I can go like that. So I can
Right.
take out everything but a single field. When we get down into the database side of things, when I go to list, so here's my listing of documents. I actually
Uh-huh.
just have this where it says data.
I see. I see.
And
Okay. Yeah.
if I didn't have that, so again, when I'm out here in my to-dos, I get to pick these columns all at will, right? So when I call the REST API for this, no one cares either. They're getting all of the data. But there's an expectation in the GraphQL world that would allow me to say, I just
Yeah.
want to do or done or something like that. And that's
Yeah.
the part that gets really intensive CPU wise for us to do, because it's manipulating, like, here's the data, here's a column, go search this. Like, it does a lot of stuff. We tried it that
Yeah.
way,
Because
but it's a little rough.
you'd have to generate a schema for
Yes,
every single database that a user creates to be
exactly.
able to make that API work. And then anytime they make a change, you have to update that schema.
Yep.
Yeah, totally. I get it because
Yep.
I mean, like, I worked for StepSend for a while,
Yeah.
um, and we had similar issues. That and like people could easily, because they could create their own, like, nesting becomes an issue in GraphQL, where
Yes.
like how deeply you nest,
Exactly.
like, because I can in theory go infinite number like layers deep, but then that gets performance wise can be a big drawback.
Yeah.
So
It
so
can
you
be
have
really
to, yeah,
difficult. Yeah.
yeah,
So in
yeah,
general, if I speak just more in general terms, as well, I think there's great capacity on the GraphQL side. If your team and you're a developer that wants to head down that road, especially like if you have some Gatsby folks that are really, yeah, totally. That's a fantastic way to go, because that entire data layer is going to be GraphQL based. So it's going to be important to know it. And then you could pipe in our stuff. If you have them doing like static page layouts and things like that from a Gatsby side of things, but then you're going to add in whatever live commenting or something like that, you could still use our GraphQL side of things.
right, yeah, that makes sense. And I guess the only negative being of the data aspect there, like the putting is overfetching, which by default you'd get on REST anyway. I mean, REST
Yes.
is by default overfetching.
Right.
So, I guess in a way you lose the benefit of not overfetching, but you get the specificity and the ability to do like a single query for all the things, right? So um, that's a benefit. That's okay. I get it. That's really cool.
Cool.
Um, so, all right, I didn't see any other questions. So
I saw a lot of CI/CD talk, but I'm not sure.
yeah, that was Tony was asking about CI/CD, but I didn't quite know. I didn't get the question if it was a question. I guess we can give him an opportunity to put it in there. But yeah, no, I mean this looks really awesome. I haven't had the chance like to mess with it myself, but it looks really cool. And I think most places that I know of have not had the ability to like be able to have both GraphQL. Like it's like I choose one or the other. Like I've done the AWS thing, and you have to kind of set
Yeah.
up things differently in order to use the GraphQL. So like,
Yeah, we're
and
trying to keep the feature parity as close as possible on all of this stuff. The
yeah,
GraphQL piece, it was definitely an engineering challenge. We're not a big team at all, and so we had one main guy. Shout out Jake. He did a lot of work on this, so it was pretty
nice,
exciting to get this one in.
awesome. All
Shout out
right.
for the Appwrite side of things. On Thursday, we actually have office hours too. So
Oh,
if you happen to catch this even at a later time, every Thursday 11 a.m. Eastern, we do office hours now. So feel free to ask more questions and we'll dive in.
Nice. All right. Yeah. So join Alex in the office hour. Oh, wait. Real quick. We got one question from come in real, if you don't mind.
I'll try.
Um, where in an e-commerce solution is the sweet spot to switch from REST to GraphQL and vice versa? Where do you get the most performance for each, and where to avoid different types of querying? So it's kind of like, I guess, a follow up to like the question I asked about your advice. I mean, is there specific advice you'd say, like for if you're building e-commerce, like is there benefit to specifically using GraphQL instead of REST, or
Yeah,
is it
so I
kind
think
of
at times there can be. It depends. So like Shopify is usually a popular one. There's a lot of different on the GraphQL side of things. There's a lot of different things you can ask for very simply. So if you're trying to keep your application light again, and you have a listing page, let's say, the really cool part on the GraphQL side is you could say, I just want the URL for my image on URL and my price, and that's it. And so that keeps the payload just tiny, 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 and it allows you to kind of search through that. I haven't used that in a long time though. I'm not an e-commerce expert by any means, but
Mhm.
so that helps things out. And then when you go to like full page, you can actually do in one single call, you can grab out all the product information about that single product and then have like a listing page beside it. So in that single call, you can go grab that really quick too. So there's a lot of benefits on the GraphQL side. I think I really like it as a spec. I'm not going to say that performance wise and things like that outside of bandwidth and things. There's caching that you can kind of account for those things on the REST API side of the world too. So there's always it's
Yeah.
probably equal when you get down to it. When you get brass tacks, it's going to be close, but I do like it for the bandwidth side on e-commerce applications for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think where I've seen it, just to kind of throw my 2 cents in here, the benefit being, like, if you're talking about e-commerce specifically, I mean, a lot of shopping is done on your mobile phone, and so if you can eliminate overfetching
Yep.
via, like, you can kind of slim down that data and potentially improve the performance of your application slightly. It's not going to be dramatic, but I mean, every little bit of data, especially when you're doing mobile, is
Yep.
helpful. And then the other benefit being, if you have scenarios where you are doing, like, oh, I query this to, like I'm going to get this ID out of here, and then from this API, and then go back and query this other API with that ID and that information to get this other data. And sometimes you have this sequence of
Yeah.
REST calls that can be very slow. And so if you can eliminate that and do a single query, well, that can actually be a significant benefit in that particular case. But it has to be like, somehow you have to have the GraphQL API to support these multiple different, um, endpoint calls that you would have had before. So yeah. Anyway, that's my take
That
on it.
that's a fantastic point. The chaining versus batching, that's huge. I mean, anytime you can
Yes.
take out the time delay on REST calls, that's a big one.